Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for joining this joint media briefing between ourselves here in the Greater Manchester area and my colleague Steve from the Liverpool City region. I will speak first and then introduce Steve in a moment. We're not going to present the normal case figures today. We're going to issue those slides later for those who want to see them. Obviously, we want to address the current situation directly. Today, myself and the 10 council leaders of Greater Manchester a united statement expressing our opposition to the proposal to put us into the Tier 3 category. What we are saying in that statement is supported by a separate statement being issued by a number of business organisations in Greater Manchester. What I wanted to do today was speak very directly to the people of Greater Manchester, to take them through the reasoning for the position that we are in and why we feel we cannot accept what this would mean and the damage that this would do to people's lives, people's businesses, and the economy in Greater Manchester as a whole. If I could kind of start with where I left off on Saturday when Steve and I did our joint press conference, and that was to raise the worry about restrictions without support, to put places under regional lockdown restrictions, but without providing the substantial support that is needed to protect people through that. And I want to kind of move things on, if you like, given what we now know about the Tier 3 proposal, by making reference initially to the words of the Chief Medical Officer at the Downing Street briefing on Monday evening, because the CMO said very clearly that he was not confident with the 3 tiers proposal if it did no more than the base case. By that I think he means closing pubs, that would be enough. Those were his words, that base case would not be enough. And he went on to say that local leaders would have to do significantly more if Tier 3 was to have success in bringing down the number of infections. So what I wanted to do today was to explain in human terms what significantly more, in the Chief Medical Officer's words, means. And I'll just go to a slide, if I may, which quantifies what the effect would be on people of the Tier 3 proposal as recommended by the Chief Medical Officer. That substantial range of closures that will be needed, in his words, to get those infections down. And this slide gives you those figures: 20,000 people employed in our 1,900 pubs, 63,000 people in accommodation and food services, 32,000 in entertainment, recreation, 20,000 taxi drivers who would be impacted by these proposals, 7,000 in hairdressing and beauty, 187,000 people who are self-employed. You know, a huge number of people will be directly affected by the widespread closure of businesses in these sectors. And beyond this, of course, there are many more businesses that would be affected, the suppliers to these industries that wouldn't be covered by the government's proposals with regard to support. If we were to go down this path, we would be, as I said at the weekend, surrendering people here to certain hardship in the run-up to Christmas. Absolutely no doubt about it. Job losses, certainly, and of course, business closures. Now, we have objected to the idea that a furlough scheme should be paid at 67%. And the Chancellor on Monday said, oh, well, people will be able to top that up with universal credit. Well, we have run some checks and we have found that if you have someone on the national minimum wage working 35 hours a week, earning around £14,000 a year, with no children, no housing costs, they would not qualify for that universal credit top up. So it's not correct to say that everybody would be able to top up their income in this way. And of course, at present, as well as an incomplete furlough offer, as we have on this slide, there are 187,000 self-employed people who would have no access to a support scheme to protect their income through this. And that is what's at stake here. And the question I would have for the government is this: in developing these proposals for a tier 3 proposal where substantial chunks of the economy have to be closed down without significant support for people and businesses in those sectors of the economy, have they done an impact assessment of what this would mean? An assessment of the mental health impact on people of forcing this level of closure across the economy in a situation where the support can't be provided to those people to stop them worrying about their bills, worrying about feeding their kids, worrying about paying the rent. I want to see that impact assessment if it's been done, because in our mind, that the health harm that would be done by an underfunded tier 3 option of the kind that we're being pressurised into accepting would do significant health harm to the people, families and communities of Greater Manchester. And that is something that we are not prepared to accept. In our view, what is being proposed here is fundamentally flawed. On the one hand, what we're being told is it will only work, it will only get the results if there is full closure. But that, of course, is putting councils in an invidious position where they are being required to nominate the extra industries that have to close down, but are not being given the support in making those decisions so that it can be done without creating harm to people and to businesses. In our view, the current tier 3 proposal is a blatant act of levelling down, and this is not what this government said it would do when it was elected. I also have to ask the question, would it be successful? A regional lockdown of this kind, even if you went for a proposal of the fullest extent, it would nevertheless still only succeed if neighbouring areas didn't have high case levels. So areas could go through all of the pain of doing this and still not find that they were able to bring their infection rates down, because obviously everyone is linked to what their neighbours might do as well. They would be sacrificing large parts of their economy without, in the end, delivering the benefit that people would want. And it feels very much to me in putting this pressure on council leaders, in making them make these decisions. The government is very much passing the buck and passing the bill to local areas. And I don't find that acceptable. We've gone from an approach that was about whatever it takes to get the country through this to a penny pinching approach to this pandemic, where the cost will fall very much on people in the real world whose businesses are already close to the brink. And here's another slide that I could just show you in terms of the economy in Greater Manchester at the moment. 25% of businesses already saying they've got cash flow issues. That's 58% of businesses in the hospitality, leisure and tourism sector. Again, huge number of businesses, 3/4 reporting reduced sales in that sector, and many more considering making redundancies. The economy is already on the brink, and to push us into tier 3 without support would in many ways push us over the edge. So that's why we are opposed to tier 3 in its current form. And essentially, I think we've got two routes ahead of us here. We have a regional approach to tackling the pandemic as being put forward by the government, but without the support needed to carry people through that approach. What we fear is a winter where large parts of the north are trapped in tier 3 without the support for people in the furlough scheme that they need, without support for people who are self-employed, without that wider support for businesses beyond the £3,000 that's been offered, and that would make for an extremely challenging situation indeed. And in those circumstances, a majority of leaders in Greater Manchester feel that it would be a preferable option, given that we are mindful that there is growing numbers of cases, and we are always prepared to do what's right to protect the health of our residents, that actually in these circumstances, at some point, if the cases continue to rise, it would be preferable to go for a national circuit break option rather than this regional approach, which we have real doubts about whether it will work. That is supported by a majority of leaders in Greater Manchester, although I should say not the leader of Bolton Council, David Greenhalgh, as was suggested at Prime Minister's questions today, and I did just want to make that clear. So I will finish before handing over to Steve by saying that for all of these reasons, we oppose the Tier 3 proposal, and we will not cave in to all of the pressure that's being applied to us unless we can be given the clear evidence, but more than that, the substantial financial support that is needed to protect our communities through this. We will not let them be levelled down by this government through this pandemic. And when I say the substantial support, I'm talking about an 80% furlough guaranteed across all of the sectors that would be required to close. I'm talking about an 80% furlough for all of those businesses who experienced a major loss of trade as a result of the restrictions because of the choking off of footfall and the customer base. I'm talking about a self-employment support scheme for those hundreds of thousands of people who would need that, a scheme which would protect their income at the level that was protected earlier this year. I'm talking of a business support scheme that goes much further and actually compensates them for the levels of losses that they are experiencing. But that hasn't been offered, and that's why I'm saying we will resist the pressure, and we will oppose any move to push us into tier 3. Just on the process, it's not acceptable that we've still not had a substantive discussion with the government about these things. We put a separate set of proposals into the government on Friday night, which do go further than where we are currently in tier 2. We've asked for summary closure powers on any businesses in Greater Manchester that are not COVID secure. We would like to take local control of test and trace. And might I just say that the idea that you only get that if you are prepared to go into tier 3 is fundamentally wrong, because actually areas in tier 3 where the cases are already higher will struggle anyway to make test and trace work at that level of cases. It would be much more sensible to give places in tiers 1 and 2 access to local control of test and trace, because they would be more able to make the system work. And that actually is an argument for the circuit break. If we had that, it would allow us to reset the test, trace and isolate system on a lower baseline of cases, and coming out of it, we would then have a much better chance of controlling the virus. But we feel, all of us here in Greater Manchester, that the pressure has been applied to us. We've not been given the chance to discuss our proposals yet with ministers, and it's not acceptable to read that we are about to be placed in tier 3 because of all of the damage that we believe that would cause. So that's the Greater Manchester position that I've laid out. I will now hand over to my good friend and colleague, most famous man in Britain this week, Mayor of the Liverpool City region, Steve Rotheram, and might I say, as far as I'm concerned, it was wrong that it was suggested that Steve had agreed to everything to put pressure on people here, because that wasn't a truthful reflection of what happened. And from our point of view, we will be standing together today in saying we do not accept being treated this way by the government, and we are very much together in making our arguments today. So, Steve, over to you.
I think infamous is the word you were grasping for, Andy. Look, the reason that myself and Andy decided to do this jointly today is because we thought it was important to comment jointly on the events of the past few weeks and the impact they're going to have on the Northwest. And it has to be said on the whole north of England also. And of course, we're great friends and people know about the rivalries in Liverpool City region and Greater Manchester, but actually there are things that we have in commonality, and there are less things than people would imagine that separates the two regions. So what we have to do is to stand together and be strong and work together, and that's what we've been doing. And some people don't get that. A number of people have said to me that the government is trying to play divide and conquer with our region and the north, and I'd hate to think that any prime minister will be doing that in the middle of the most serious crisis our country has faced since the end of the Second World War. I don't believe that would be acceptable. This should be a time where we set aside party political manoeuvrings and focus all of our energy on beating this harmful and often still deadly virus. Unfortunately, too often I get the sense that government are doing things which divide our communities instead of standing by them and trying to get us to unite. Rather than working with us over the summer, for instance, by devolving power and resources that Andy and myself and our local councils had requested to tackle the coronavirus in our areas, it wasn't actually until Friday that we were asked for our input. But over the last few days, we've seen what that has meant when we've entered the era of Devo blame. However, Andy and I are absolutely clear. We're not going to be allowing ourselves to be divided. We're not going to allow our regions to be divided. And we will do our damnedest to ensure that the North is not divided for that matter. And we're not going to stand by while the government plays politics with us, or we're not going to stand by and not do anything about holding the government to account. People will hopefully already know, because you'll have seen what's happening in our area, but the Liverpool City region is in a very dangerous moment. The numbers in our region are increasing incredibly rapidly. Infection rates have risen exponentially, and you'll see that on this slide showing the increase in the 7-day positivity rate since the start of September. Now, despite these figures, a lot of people have been asking why our region has been singled out, pointing to the infection rates in other places. But the infection rate, of course, is only one indicator of the situation and not the only factor that the government takes into account. In our area, our cases aren't just confined to young people. We have a higher percentage of our cases amongst people aged 60 and over, who are at the greatest risk from COVID. And we'll see that on the next slide, showing the age profile of our cases. And in our area, hospital and intensive care admissions, where our region has less capacity than others, are rising sharply. Currently, there's a real and present danger that our NHS could be overwhelmed, our NHS. And I think this is demonstrated on the final slide showing hospitalisations in the region, which have almost doubled week to week. The number of people in our hospitals across the region have more than doubled from last week to this. Now, Liverpool alone has the highest, this is the city of Liverpool, has the highest levels of hospitalisations in the country and the third highest in Europe. The COVID outbreak isn't on its way in our region. It's already here. It's doing serious damage as we speak. There are people walking around our region today who will be in hospital or worse in the coming days and weeks, but who don't realise it yet. With each passing day, that number is going up and up and up. And the situation in our region is so serious that the government didn't give us a choice about whether we could be in tier 2 or tier 3. We were going into tier 3 no matter what. And unfortunately, the sad fact is that looking at current trends, while we might be the first region in tier 3, unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be the last. A lot has been said over the last few days about what went between our region and the government and what were them talks and what really went on. And so I don't really want to dwell too much on that, but I said my piece yesterday and made it clear that this, what we've got, tier 3, was done to us, not with us. So I'll let people decide for themselves whether they believe me or others on that fact. But people, I do realise, are frustrated by the new measures. Nobody wants to curtail freedoms or damage the economy and the sectors in our city region and cause hardship for anyone. But we have tier 3 restrictions in place from today, and they are the law. We have to all abide by them, just as we did back in March, and everybody needs to take it as seriously as they did back then. Now, we have no choice, but the alternative is to see our city region overrun with sickness and death. And of course, this thing about the long COVID, and that is no choice for anybody at all. So I was disappointed to see the shameful scenes really from a minority of people in Concert Square last night in Liverpool city centre, and I think that's being condemned by leaders in the area. And actions like that don't help anyone. Instead, they only risk making the situation worse and potentially making the restrictions even last longer. So we would say to people, it was unfortunate. The pubs are closed now, and hopefully we won't see a return to anything like that. Now, we may not have had a choice about the new restrictions, but we do have a choice of how we respond to the new restrictions. And time again, we've pressed the government on the need for extra financial support for those businesses, the jobs, and the people who are going to be hit hardest by the imposition of government of those new restrictions. And while the Chancellor announced last Friday that a new furlough scheme would be introduced to support the new tier system, that was the right thing to do. But in its current form, the scheme is inadequate and risks putting tens of thousands of low-paid workers significantly below the national minimum wage. And Andy's right about this. This is one of our red lines. We really believe that the imposition of restrictions into a tier 2 or tier 3 means that we do have to do more for low-paid workers, amongst others. I'm concerned that the direct support to businesses is also less than that offered during the national lockdown back in March. So on Sunday, I spoke with the Prime Minister about the issues in our area, and on Monday I was invited to attend Cobra, where I put those concerns directly to him on behalf of the elected leaders who'd asked me to go and represent them, and also the 1.6 million people in our city region. And as a result, we've secured a commitment from the Prime Minister that the government will continue to engage in meaningful talks with us on these matters. And so today, myself, the Mayor of Liverpool, Joe Anderson, and our 5 council leaders have written to the Chancellor, and we're asking for those talks to be stepped up. We need to accelerate those so we can reach an agreement as soon as possible. But I know that those who are being hit hard by the restrictions coming into force today need extra help, and that help can't come soon enough. And I know what it's like to run your own business, you know, worrying about whether you'll be able to keep the lights on. So whilst we wait to see if we can get those further concessions from government, working with them in the best interests of the lives and livelihoods in our city region, we're going to step up to the plate locally. We're not just going to wait for them to do it. If the government won't act to protect local jobs and businesses, then we will. And less than 2 weeks ago, we announced the only local scheme in the country for businesses affected by what was then similar to Tier 2 restrictions. And we've put up to £40 million in an emergency stopgap scheme. But now that we're Tier 3, we face a slightly different set of challenges and restrictions that are going to hit the economy. So we'll be announcing a revised emergency stopgap scheme to take account that we are now in Tier 3, and with those restrictions we aim to improve on the furlough scheme announced by the Chancellor, Furlough Light, and we're going to have a local furlough and business support scheme that will do what the government have failed to do. And our intention then is to fill the gap left by the national furlough scheme, you know, downgrading something from 80% to 67%. That's no good, because that will force businesses to close. But also there'll be plenty who remain open, but will be detrimentally impacted, of course, by the reduction in footfall, for instance. So we'll be doing something, and we'll be releasing the details of that scheme and how we're going to operate it as soon as we possibly can. And we will announce the final details of all that tomorrow. But the message is clear. We're in Tier 3. The government put us into Tier 3, and we need to do everything to provide stopgap funding that the government should be providing on those Tier 3 authorities. And we shouldn't be in any doubt that they need to keep their word about working with us meaningfully to get that additional support for our businesses who are desperately in need of help. And we're not going to allow them, the government, to do lockdown on the north on the cheap. And so Andy and myself stand together united to push the government to do the right thing, not just by the government, but by the people. And with that, I'll hand over to Andy to take any questions.
Thanks, Steve. It's really clear what you've said. And, you know, I know the position you've been in the last few days, because we took a difficult decision here back in the summer to accept local restrictions. You know, the suggestion has been that you and I wouldn't take difficult decisions. Well, we have done. And people here have been living under those restrictions for 10 weeks. And we will always do what's right to protect the health of our residents. You will, I will. Our city regions are in different positions today. We've got lower number of cases here than you, although we were higher before. And our hospitalisation rate is lower as well. But therefore, we've got a different argument about Tier 2 and Tier 3. But Steve, where we're absolutely united is we should neither of us be facing the prospect of Tier 3 without substantial financial support. And it's really quite disgraceful that you are in that position and you still are having to ask for conversations with the Chancellor. Fundamentally unacceptable. So with that, Ross, I'll leave it there, and we'll dig into people's questions if that's okay.
We've got a lot of questions today, so thanks very much all that have submitted them. I might not get to take follow-ups, so I'll just do my best to get through them the best I can. I'm going to go to a question from Leslie Day at BBC News at 2:01 PM. For Andy, you say you will not accept Tier 3. What does that mean in concrete terms? Will you go against the measures if Manchester's moved into Tier 3 by national government? And a similar question from Steph Oliver at Sky News. How concerned are you that central government will ignore you and the other GM leaders and move Greater Manchester into Tier 3 lockdown restrictions? And do you have any meetings with central government about this issue?
Well, thank you both for your question. So I was quite clear in what I said at the beginning. We won't accept it on the current terms because, as Steve has just described, they were put in it without the support that they needed, and we just think that is morally wrong because you're risking people's health in a different way. You're risking a mental health crisis on top of a pandemic where people start worrying about their jobs, worrying about their businesses. It's just not right to do that to people. And in our case, as I said before, that's hundreds of thousands of people who would be put in that position. So the message I've got is we wouldn't accept Tier 3 on the current terms, the terms that they forced onto Steve Rotheram and the Liverpool City region. I've been quite clear, it's an 80% furlough across all of the industries closed, but also those industries suffering an indirect major loss of trade. It's a self-employment scheme at 80% for everybody, freelancers and others who are affected by these proposals. It's a proper business support scheme to stop businesses with cash flow problems going bust. That is what we are talking about. And until anything like that is on the table, we will not be able to accept the Tier 3 proposal because they are asking us to commit an act of self-harm in levelling down our economy. So it will be for the government to decide whether it wants to do that. I would put it to them that it is to break the very main promise upon which they were elected. We've been waiting all weekend actually to begin discussions with the government. I believe we have a discussion later today with the Deputy Chief Medical Officer to talk about the latest evidence on Greater Manchester, and that is welcome. And we would at any moment sit down and discuss all of these things with the government. But the first question I would have for them would be, have you done a health impact on imposing this level of closures in our economy without supporting people to cope with what that would mean?
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to go to Carl Dinnan at ITV News 202. With the current level of support on offer, would you support a national circuit breaker? And if the government puts Greater Manchester into Tier 3 and you haven't had a support package, what can you do about it? Similar question from Tom Dambach at Hits Radio. Which is at 2 o'clock. Some Greater Manchester leaders believe a circuit break, but not all. It seems there's a divide nationally about the right action about what the right action to take is. Can leaders here not agree on what needs to happen? How difficult will it be to find the right solution here?
Thank you both. So there are different views, aren't there, about this, but let me just be really clear about where I see things now. As I said, there's two routes ahead of us. There's a regional route or there's a national route. My great fear is we're going to see a position where areas one by one are going to have pressure piled upon them to go into Tier 3 because that's a kind of easier option for the government. It's cheaper. It puts all the pressure on local leaders without the support. And I think a winter where most of the north is trapped in Tier 3 is going to be very, very serious indeed. So alongside that, then you could look at it being dealt with more at a national level when the case numbers got to a point where that was justified. And I think there's a debate to be had about the timing of any circuit break. But I think that is more likely to succeed for three reasons, because it's being done nationally. So there isn't that opportunity for a neighbouring area to bring cases back into a Tier 3 area. That's one reason. The second reason is national support would come with a national circuit break, and that would deal with the issues that I'm raising about the economy. And then the third reason, and a very important reason, is that it would bring cases down further, which would then allow local areas to reset test and trace as a locally controlled system. We're already being told that the cases are too high to be able to get a hold on test and trace. And that's why it's a very flawed proposal for the government to only offer local control of test and trace to those areas in Tier 3. It's to go about it completely the wrong way. They should be doing it on a Tier 1 basis, if anything, first. And that's why I have come down to the view that a circuit break of the kind being proposed by the leader of the opposition would be a better and a fairer way of keeping the country together, not accentuating regional divides, and actually giving us a chance of facing this winter with more control of test and trace.
Thanks, Andy. Beth Rigby at Sky News asks you, Andy, on the one hand, you say case numbers are not serious enough to warrant tier 3 restrictions, but you're also saying that the situation is serious enough to warrant a national circuit break. Isn't this exactly the sort of indecisive leadership people are tired of?
No, it's not indecisive at all, Beth. So let me just explain to you. I'm saying that on today's evidence, Greater Manchester, in our view, should not be in tier 3. Because while we have a high number of cases, it is not higher than some other areas that are in tier 2. I think Nottingham, on the latest figures, significantly higher than where we are. Liverpool is higher than where we are. It's case numbers alongside hospitalisation as well, and there has been a steady increase in the number of daily admissions to hospital here, but it's nothing like the position that we're seeing in Merseyside. So the evidence is different. But what I'm saying, Beth, is that evidence today doesn't justify a circuit break. What we've got to look at is, as the picture changes, what will be the best way to deal with it? And I'm saying today that I don't think tier 3 will be the best way to deal with it, because on the current system, councils would be incentivised to go for the minimum level of closures because they aren't being funded to do any more. But we heard from the Chief Medical Officer on Monday that won't be enough. So they have to do the full range of closures to get the effect. But of course, that will cause health harm in a different way because that's unfunded extensive closures. So what I'm saying is tier 2 is right for Greater Manchester today. And the best way, if there were to be growth in cases later down the line, tier 3 would not be the best way to deal with that. A circuit break, in my view, across the country, because we're seeing the R number above 1 in all regions, would be the right thing to do to reset the country ahead of the winter. And I think it would bring, it would create a greater sense of fairness about how things are being done. So it's not indecisive at all. It's completely logical. We believe it's tier 2 today. We would always watch how the evidence changed, and we would always protect people's health. But in the event that we saw a change of the kind that Steve has experienced in Liverpool, we would say a circuit break is a better way to deal with that than pushing us into tier 3 with all of the problems that brings.
Thanks, Andy. For Steve, a question from Luke Traynor at the Liverpool Echo. Keir Starmer is today calling for a circuit breaker lockdown rather than individual local restrictions, saying the latter has failed to work in the past. Was your preference for the Liverpool City region to be subjected to a short 2-3 week circuit breaker lockdown rather than being put into tier 3? And can you discuss the merits of the system city leaders would have preferred and which particular systems you would have pushed for?
Thanks, Luke. What we would have preferred is exactly what the proposed circuit breaker would do, and that is to follow the science. We've asked all along if the government could provide us with the scientific basis for the sets of restrictions that we've had, and we've had several iterations over the last few months. People might not know, but just 3 weeks ago, we had a new set of restrictions that only came into force a couple of weeks ago on the Saturday morning. And before they'd even had time to be assessed, we read on the following Wednesday that we were going to go into tier 3. And we knew we were going into tier 3 because it was on the front page of the Times. And so we've had very little in regard to wriggle room. But Sage said that we should have a circuit break of 2 to 3 weeks several weeks ago. And if that had to come into force, I believe that would have had a significant impact on the exponential rises that we were seeing, because that's the thing about those exponential rises, they're compounded every single day by more and more people who are spreading to more and more people. And if it had been a few weeks ago, I believe that we would have started to get in our area the virus under control, and potentially we wouldn't have needed to even go into tier 3, and we would have been out of it a lot quicker, because what we don't want is a prolonged period of the economic pain that we know that tier 3 is going to cause, hence our campaigning for additional resources. But we want to be out by Christmas. We want people and businesses to enjoy as near as possible a COVID-free type Christmas. Now, we know we're never going to get to where we were last year, but we'd like to get back to some sort of normality so that people can go out and hopefully look forward to Christmas, which at the moment I think a lot of businesses are only looking forward to the dread of not being open at Christmas. So I think a national circuit break would have done fantastically to have tackled some of those underlying issues. But I do understand that not everywhere in the country is in the same position as we are. I spoke to one of the Metro mayors from the other end of the country who said that their average rate is only about 37 per 100,000. We've got an area in our city region that a few weeks ago was on 100 per 100,000, and today is on over 700 per 100,000, and that's the differences in different areas. So I believe Keir Starmer is absolutely right, that we at some stage are going to potentially look towards a nationwide circuit break.
Thanks, Steve. 2 more questions for you specifically. Eloise Linford at Radio City asks, how close are Liverpool's hospitals to breaking point? What plans do you have in place for the growing numbers of cases, and might it reach a point where staff need to pick and choose who to treat? And Leslie Day at BBC News last night saw young people on the streets angry with the police, gyms refusing to close. Who is to blame for this division, and who is to take ownership of it?
Well, just on the first part on the hospitals, it's not me saying anything. The hospitals will be making a statement today. The hospitals are concerned that they could be overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of people who are presenting with COVID symptoms, and of course the strain that puts on ICU and on other functions within the hospital. And people talk about the Nightingale Hospital in Manchester. I think many people don't really understand. It's in Manchester, but it's the Northwest Nightingale Hospital, and they're on standby because we can see the trends. And so our hospitals doing everything that they can, and everybody loves the NHS, and quite rightly so. But those people, moving on to the second part of the question, those people who were out on the streets last night, they could be endangering their own families, but they could be endangering the frontline staff, the heroes who for 7 months have had to go beyond the call of duty to treat people with those symptoms. And there could be people who have now got COVID symptoms from last night that won't manifest themselves for a couple of weeks. And I think that is, sheer madness for people to be putting themselves in the situation, but potentially to become spreaders of this terrible disease. And just on the last one about, who's to blame for this, I genuinely don't think that is a good space to be in. But the one thing I would say, I think it's irresponsible of the government to try to devolve blame. We all need to be in this to try and work together to get the numbers in our areas down. And that's why myself and the council leaders entered into those talks on Friday night, because we want to preserve life, but also we need a package of support that preserves the livelihoods of the people in our area.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to take a question from Josh Halliday at The Guardian. He asks, Andy, do you expect central government to decide today whether GM goes into tier 3? And when you say you won't accept tier 3, does this mean you'll begin legal action if it's imposed? That's Josh Halliday at 2:31. And also Kate McCann at The Sun asks, if government put you in tier 3 without your approval, would you try and boycott it, block it? Are you planning legal action if the government tries to close your pubs? What does this concretely mean?
Okay, thanks very much, both of you. I mean, the first thing just to say again about tier 3, the chief medical officer said it on Monday. He expressed doubts about whether it will work. And I just wonder why we're pinning a national strategy on a proposal that the chief medical officer said in its base case scenario won't do the job. It seems to me to be sort of backing the wrong horse. You know, to suggest that local lockdowns will do it. There isn't the evidence anywhere that local lockdowns so far will turn the figures around. And, you know, we've had 10 weeks of them. We've had them longer than anywhere. So we're in a position to know this, and it's why we're very sceptical about it. When I say I won't accept it, just to be clear again, Josh, on the terms on which they were forced on Steve, you know, we just have the benefit because our cases weren't quite like Steve's. We weren't first in the room having the discussions, but we're next in the room, or two or three behind Steve. And when I say I won't accept it, you know, I've got more time to say no. We won't accept people having their jobs taken off them, their businesses taken off them without proper compensation. And what I mean by that is 80% furlough across the board. That was good enough earlier in the year. It should be good enough now. If the government wants to do its tier 3, fully fund it, fully back it. Don't put all the pressure on local leaders and let them take the pain and the blame for what you're not prepared to do. It simply isn't the way to run the country, particularly not when you were elected to level up. So when I say I won't accept it, I'm expressing my view and the view of the other leaders. We will not accept level 3 in its current form. And if the government insists that that is it and there's no further discussion, they will probably have to impose it. I'm not saying that we would in any way ask people to defy it. Obviously, we respect the law of the land, but it would be clear that it had been done in that way without our consent. And you know, there is an issue around legal action. I would be very concerned for people who are self-employed here, people working in the taxi trade or the security industry, that would see their income collapse, to be honest, if we see widespread closure of hospitality, leisure business. You know, I would try and support them. I'm sure Steve would do the same for people in his city region. We might even consider some joint action in that space, because we won't let people just be kind of sent to the wall. We're not going to let that happen. And I don't think we should be put in this position where we're having to fight like this in the middle of a national pandemic. It should be whatever it takes. Let's get through this together, get our focus back on fighting the virus. But I'm afraid the way the government is handling this isn't allowing that. So I hope I've answered your question. It would have to be by imposition, not through consent. But we are law-abiding people. We would respect the law of the land, but we would consider other routes, legal routes, where we could protect our many thousands of residents who are going to be left in severe hardship in the run-up to Christmas. We would not just leave them in the lurch. We would try and support them, and that would include any legal action we could take on their behalf.
Thanks, Andy. And that was a question from Kate Ferguson at The Sun, not Kate McCann, as I said incorrectly there. A question from Charlotte Cox at the Manchester Evening News. Following months of complaints from relatives of care home residents, care home bosses and charities over a lack of visiting rights for loved ones, Social Care Minister Helen Whatley said a trial would take place in which a relative or friend would be treated as a key worker and given frequent access. As time is of the essence with this, are you concerned there is yet to be a date or location for this pilot? Do you think it should take place in Greater Manchester? And with delays in testing, do you foresee there being an issue with the plan to have relatives tested weekly?
Thanks, Ross. That was Charlotte, wasn't it, with that question?
Charlotte Cox.
Such a harrowing issue, Charlotte, particularly when you hear some of the reports on the Today programme this morning of residents and families who've been affected by this. So absolutely fully with you, and we've agonised about this issue as Greater Manchester. I think this goes to the heart of the handling of this situation. I think from a national point of view, in the Gold meeting or in the discussions that are had around it, I think they see the virus and they've got a laser focus on the virus and how it's moving and where it's transmitting. But I don't think they've got enough focus on people and their lives and what's happening, the collateral damage, if you like, from the national response that we're mounting at the moment, and particularly how that is felt by families whose loved ones are in care homes. I think we should work hard to create the best circumstances we can in each care home to allow visits to happen on an exceptional basis. And I think we need a lot of effort going into that. That's what we would like to see here in Greater Manchester, of course, with the necessary controls. But I think it is essential now that people in care homes see that people worried about loved ones in care homes get to see them, and there is some form of regular contact that can be established. I think we've hit a point here where that has to happen.
Thanks, Andy. Another question for you from Andrew Noel at the Wigan Post. Will you look to maintain a uniform approach across all of Greater Manchester, or would you support councils taking different approaches across the city region should the number of cases, hospitalisations and deaths diverge considerably?
Well, thanks, Andrew. But yeah, we saw that in the summer, didn't we? And it wasn't a good experience. And in retrospect, it was quite divisive. I think we're in a different position now. I think we do have to approach this as Greater Manchester. The logic of the government's tier system is asking us to do that. I think we kind of went down that path earlier in the summer. A patchwork of different arrangements didn't work particularly well. I think we do now need to stick together as Greater Manchester, and obviously the statement issued today is by all of the 10 leaders and myself. It's a very clear position, it's unanimous, it's cross-party, and we will be going forward on that basis.
Another one for you, Andy, from Andy Bounds at the Financial Times. What level of hospital admissions would you endorse before entering Tier 3? So Liverpool City Region was about 60% of the April peak when it did so.
The problem with the question, if I could just say, Andy, is the implication that Tier 3 will definitely work. I mean, we've effectively had Tier 3 in Bolton. There may have been some impact on the figures, but I think it's a big assumption at this stage to say that you just go into Tier 3 and it automatically turns things around. I don't think it does, and that's what the Chief Medical Officer, if I was hearing him correctly, was saying on Monday night. For Tier 3 to work, it has to be widespread closures. And obviously you then have to balance those widespread closures with what the health harm is in a different way. So it's why I've said we're in an invidious position. Of course, we watch the health statistics. We will always do what's right to protect the health of our residents. Our hospital, if I could give you a few figures, if it helps, about 30% of our ITU capacity in Greater Manchester is currently occupied by patients with COVID. So that is reasonably high, but of course it means that there is a significant amount of capacity that isn't occupied in that way. We've seen a steady increase in the number of people being admitted to hospital, but it's by no means the exponential increase that Steve and colleagues have experienced in the Liverpool City region. So we are never complacent about the health figures. But it's what I'm saying to you is if those figures did rise, what I'm saying to you today is it's not Tier 3 that would sort out those figures more quickly. A national circuit break would be more likely, in my view, to turn those rates of hospitalisation down the other way. And that's the judgment the Leader of the Opposition has come to. It's Sage's judgment. I think that is the right judgment. If you want to turn the figures around, it is much more likely to happen with decisive national action than it is with a kind of halfway house Tier 3 option that is not fully funded and therefore not fully comprehensive in terms of the cover it can provide.
Thanks, Andy. A question for both, two questions for both you and Steve. We'll go to you first. Is the breaking point, Dean Kirby at the Eye, is this a breaking point in relations between devolved northern regions and central government? And are you expecting the government will impose Tier 3 this week, and what will GM do in response? Jess Forbes at Global. People seem to have lost sight of why the restrictions are needed. It feels like things have turned very political with the talks of deals being made and broken over restrictions. Do you think this is the case? So Andy, do you want to take those two first, and we'll go to Steve?
No, I don't think it's a breaking point. It's certainly, a tense sort of moment. But no, I mean, I keep reiterating it. I've said it all year. I'm willing to work with the government to get this right. But I think what's created to the climate that we've had in recent days is what Steve referred to. You know, the briefing to newspapers about pubs being closed, the meetings that were had at the weekend where we were just basically being told to accept our fate. I mean, that isn't acceptable. You know, we can't do that. We are elected, both of us, to represent millions of people. We have to do whatever we can to protect them in terms of their health, but their livelihoods as well. And that's what we are doing. And this is the reality of this system of governance that the government created. You know, mayors are there for a purpose, to represent the best interests, as we see it, of the people that elected us. And we're doing our job. And I think it's now for central government and Whitehall to understand this system more and to work with it in a more collaborative way than it has been doing throughout this. It hasn't been listening. You know, how many times have you heard me on this press briefing say we need local control of test and trace, people on the ground? At the weekend, you know, I heard the community secretary saying, you know what, we've got a great new idea. We're going to put people on the ground to do contact tracing. It is so frustrating because councils up and down the land have been saying that for months and they haven't been listening. So no, I wouldn't say it's a breaking point. It's a period of turbulence, certainly. But I would still say to the Prime Minister today, if you do the right thing, if you support people properly, if you remain committed to levelling up, not levelling down, you know, there is a way of bringing an accommodation here and coming back. I personally don't think Tier 3 will work, but as long as it's a fully funded and backed Tier 3, it has more of a chance than doing it on the cheap, as Steve Rotheram has said today. So no, this isn't politics or party politics, to answer the second part of the question. It's representation, and there's a really big difference between those two things. When Steve and I left Westminster, we left the point scoring, the party politics there. We came out of there because the two of us love the northwest of England. It's where we're from. It's what we care about. We care about the place, its people. It's our job to speak up for them and ensure that they aren't just kind of ridden roughshod over by an out of touch Whitehall machine. We're not going to let that happen. And if that comes over as politics, well, I can understand why some people might see it way, but it isn't. It's representation of people's best interests, standing up for our communities, and that's what we're both doing here. And please don't sort of misinterpret it for party politics.
Thanks. I'll put that over to Steve.
Thanks. For me, I'd call it a difficult moment in time. I think it was easier back in March for the government when there was a national lockdown. Nobody blamed the government. Everybody accepted that we needed to do something because there needed to be a national lockdown. And then it became confused, didn't it? Because of all the different tiers and strands and different restrictions in different areas and all that. But when the going got tough, the government's spin machine got going, and it shouldn't be about the government trying to score points over local politicians. It should be about everybody working together to try and get the best package, scientifically backed, that will have the desired effect of taking those exponential increases and doing something with them. In our case, we need to really radically start to see those numbers reduce, really bearing down on the causes behind them. And we were told by government that it would be about 60% reduction that we'd need in our area to get below the R rate of 1. But they didn't give us all the tools at our disposal. For instance, they said you can't close schools, you can't close universities, you can't close the retail sector, etc., etc. So it left us with very little wriggle room, and then we were presented with a fait accompli. This is your suite of reductions, restrictions. You know, this is what you're going to have to take. It's not party politics to try and fight for the best deal from the areas that we represent. You know, Andy's got 2.5 million, whatever it is, more in Greater Manchester. I've got 1.6 million people in our area. That's who we represent, and that's what we will do. And by the way, the government, whether they voted for them or not, also represents those 2.5, 3 million and the 1.6 million in our area. So there shouldn't be differences, and that's why we put aside those party political positions when we went into talks, and we genuinely wanted to get a deal that we could go out in our area and say to people, look, we don't know whether actually those measures are the right measures, but let's put that aside. And the reason that we don't know is because we've asked for the science behind them and we've not been provided with it. But the government says they're going to do this anyway. And so what can we get that will ensure that we can have a wider, comprehensive business support package? So when we do come out of whatever the restrictions are, that then means we'll have businesses who will be able to still function. Without it, it's a death by 1,000 cuts. And I agree with Andy. The difficulty is that if you're into tier 2 and you get these piecemeal restrictions, you'll see footfall start to reduce, and that will put pressure on local economies. So the government needs to better support areas so that they, working together, can support the businesses and the jobs in those areas.
Thanks, Steve. I think we'll go for another 15 minutes, if that's okay, with the mayors. We started a bit later, but I'm not going to be able to take follow-up questions from those who have asked. I'll just try and take those who haven't had a question yet. So, Andy, to you first. Kevin Fitzpatrick, Radio Manchester. Is a circuit breaker inevitable, and do you support one as if government say it's required? And then I'll take Phil Munns, his colleague in Merseyside, for Steve.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's inevitable, but I think it's probably likely and more probable that it will get the results that we need. I think the way the case is developing, Kevin, I think you would say even perhaps that it's highly likely. I personally think there is a debate about when the optimum time for that would be, so that we get maximum benefit going into the winter. I think the key period for me is the early part of January. So you have to think about that, because that is when the National Health Service experiences the greatest pressure in the calendar year, those first 2-3 weeks of January. And I think the timing of any circuit break would have to be thought through to ensure that we protect the NHS as best as we can in that particular period. And so the judgment would have to be made, when would a circuit break come to reduce that pressure on the NHS. That just happens to be my view. I agree with the leader of the opposition that a circuit is needed. I've come to that conclusion. I say it's likely. I think it's almost certainly going to be needed at some point. Whether that's immediately or a little bit later down the line is to be debated. But I think the key is helping the NHS, preventing it from becoming overwhelmed over the winter period, and I think that's the key thing that should determine the timing of any circuit break.
Thanks. And Steve, Phil Munns at BBC Radio Merseyside. Joe Anderson has told us he's considering a 2-week break for Liverpool schools this half term to try and reduce the new infection rate. He says between 1/4 and 1/3 of pupils are currently self-isolating. Do you think this is a good idea, and is it something you would advise all council leaders in the Liverpool City region to consider?
Well, I wouldn't presume to advise council leaders to do what they're elected to do. They'll do the right thing in their individual areas. It does seem to make more sense, doesn't it, if it was on a city region footprint, because of course people live in one area but could go to a school in a neighbouring borough. So a footprint of probably the city region might be something to consider, and I'll certainly be speaking to Joe and the other leaders to see whether we can get some sort of agreement on that. But the problem with all this is that schools being off mean that people won't be able to go to work. In lots of our working class communities, they are the least able to work from home because many of them are doing front-facing roles, and that needs to be understood by the government. That's why we're being so determined, and I'll just repeat it again, to get a fair funding package for our area. We're not asking for handouts, we're asking for what the government did back in March. If it was right in March, then it's right today. And we've been put into tier 3 through no choice of our own, and the government needs to stand by us, because we need to demonstrate, if the government want to, that tier 3 restrictions can work. And then other areas might say, OK, I've seen what's happened almost as a pilot scheme in the Liverpool City region. We might look to that because it's demonstrably worked. But if it's going to be, we've put you into there and now you're on your own, then I think it's almost doomed to failure. And what we need at this moment is anything but that. We need to make the numbers go down so that we can start to return our economy to some sort of normality. And just on a final point about the sort of the challenges locally that you can do, you know, Andy's talked about potentially what he might be thinking of with regard to legal challenges. I think the thing that we might well be talking about collectively is getting together and challenging this presumption that people can live on 2/3 of their wages. Because we're in tier 3, that hits the hospitality sector, and the hospitality sector has some of the lowest paid jobs in the country, and we have some communities that disproportionately rely on the likes of hospitality jobs. So for me, it appears to be discriminatory that the government is saying, well, you know, we gave people 80% in March, but because it's happening to somewhere in the Liverpool City region, you're only going to be able to get 2/3 of your wage. I don't believe that there'll be many places that they will be able to cope, and I believe therefore it could be discriminatory, and we can't ask those at the bottom of the wage ladder to be having their incomes cut by 1/3. You know, will everything that they have to buy be cut by 1/3 also during this period? I don't think that's the case, and therefore we're going to be having further discussions about whether we come together to see whether there is a case for us to take forward.
Thanks, Steve. Andy, for you, Jen Williams at the MEN, your own modelling shows that our beds will be at April peak levels at the end of this month. When you're also trying to play catch up with the electives, are you not overplaying the idea that our hospitals don't have a problem?
No, I wouldn't want to appear that we're in any way complacent about the situation in our hospitals, Jen. The leaders and myself have had a very full briefing on the situation today. Sir Richard Lees updated our meeting today and did point out, actually, though, that the pressure on our hospitals this time is different, in that there are more treatments available to patients with COVID than there were before, and because of that there are fewer on mechanical ventilation, and those on mechanical ventilation end up occupying beds for much longer. So there is certainly a lot of pressure, but it isn't entirely the same as the wave that hit us in April, May, and again we'll be learning as we go along. So we're not in any way complacent about that. Please believe me when I say that. But actually, I come back to what I was saying to Kevin Fitzpatrick. The question is, what will be more likely to take the pressure off hospitals? An underfunded tier 3 proposal, or a circuit break when that is needed? That's the question, I think. And that's the question that the Prime Minister really needs to be honest about, because I think he had concluded earlier in this that a circuit break might be needed. But it would appear, possibly for financial reasons, that the Treasury insisted on this tiers approach with all of the costs sort of loaded onto local areas, letting people pay the price with their jobs and their salaries for this. That seems to be what's happened. The Treasury have sort of dictated this approach, this regional approach that's now being adopted. Very strange approach for a government committed to levelling up. I think the question that he has to sort of really think about is, what would it do most to prevent hospitals from becoming overwhelmed and actually in the end to save lives? And I think the science is very clear about this, and SAGE too, that a circuit break would be more likely to take that pressure off hospitals. And that's why I'm saying that, it's for us here, it's an approach of stick with what we've got, because the public understand it, work with our districts to manage down the number of cases, be very vigilant about the position within our hospitals, but then support the calls for a national circuit break when the time is right. As I said before, that's not the view of every leader, but it is the view of a clear majority of our leaders, and that's the way we think we would save most lives and best protect the regional economy. And I'm absolutely clear now that that is the right strategy for us to endorse.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to take this question from Katie Hazeltine at That's Manchester, and then a final two questions that deal with the stats, and we can show the slides at that point. So the first question is from Katie Hazeltine. I've spoken to people who use gyms as a way of coping with mental health challenges, and they're worried about how they will cope if gyms are closed indefinitely. In the summer, there was options for training outside, but as weather gets worse, options are limited. How can you ensure that people are supported?
Well, I think it's a really good question again, Katie, and I think this is the issue, isn't it? If you sit in Whitehall and just look at the statistics about the virus, you miss the bigger picture about people's health. I think, as Steve was saying earlier, health is more than COVID. And I think we've all got to kind of recognise this. There are balances to be struck in all of this, and if you don't have evidence that places like gyms are responsible for a significant spread of the virus, then you have to say, well, why should they close? Just to be seen to be doing something? And I think sometimes that's how Whitehall policy is made. So we obviously take the evidence very, very seriously, and we've made our arguments about hospitality, and we would look at gyms in exactly the same way. It's all got to be evidence-based, because if it isn't, the public won't believe it, they won't buy into it, and I think we're beginning to struggle with some of that right now. So I fully take your point about seeing health in its widest terms, and that's certainly the view of myself and our leaders.
Two final questions, and apologies to those I've not managed to get to. Charlotte Green at the Manchester Evening News: is Greater Manchester seeing a rise overall in the number of over 60s needing to be hospitalised with COVID? And Michael Gaffney at Heart and Smooth: what's the situation with the GM hospital sickness or absence, and what's the plan for managing staff levels through the second peak, especially if staff have to be reallocated for the Nightingale and other additional facilities? And I thought this might be a point to show the slides.
Yeah, if you could, if Kate could stick up the GM hospital slide. I think we saw some of Steve's earlier, didn't we? But we will issue all of the slides, colleagues, by the way, that you're familiar with at the end of this press conference. I think, Kate, if you go on to the hospital slide, that's the one. So, Charlotte, in answer to your question, I don't have a figure for over 60s, which is, I think, what you asked about. But there's the picture on weekly admissions, and it's actually quite an interesting picture in that it was quite steady-ish for a number of weeks, but there's clearly been an increase in the last week, and that might be the beginnings of the effect that Jen Williams was describing a moment ago. Although I have to say that it's still only what you might call a steady increase. It's certainly not the increase that Steve has seen in hospitals in the Liverpool City region. So, while it was only 31 last week, that was a bit of an outlier because that was the lowest for 5 weeks. If you go back to the week before, it was 49 in terms of admissions. Now, the majority of those are people over 60, but I wouldn't want to give you the assurance that they were all over 60 because I don't think they are. Then, of course, you've got diagnoses for COVID-19, and some of those on the second line would be hospital-acquired infections. So that obviously has to be borne into account. But if you look in the final two lines there, I mean, it's what I've been saying earlier about there being a steady increase, but it not being beyond what the system can cope with at the moment. And this answers your question, Michael. I mean, of course, there's going to be pressure on the system as we go into the winter, and we are beginning to mobilise the Nightingale to provide smaller scale rehabilitation, step down support at the moment. But obviously that support, that system needs to be there as we go into the winter. It's why I make the point about the circuit break being time to take maximum pressure off the NHS, because it's going to be a really tough winter, and that's why I think the circuit break will be needed. Without it, in my view, a kind of patchwork of tier 3 areas won't be enough, I don't think, to stop the NHS from suffering severe pressure this winter. I think the circuit break is the only thing that will do that, and it's why I would put back to the government, if that's what you were told, and it would be clear that many people in government were convinced of that a few weeks ago. I think the only right thing to do is to acknowledge that now, and to work with the leader of the opposition on a circuit break that the country can get behind.
I think that's us. Unless Steve, you want to come in on that point.
I tell you what, I wouldn't mind just touching on the point that was raised about mental health, because we're already strategising in the Liverpool City region that there is definitely I keep on looking down actually, and I keep on forgetting that the camera's higher up. We're looking at the issues around mental health and well-being, and we're talking to Joe Rafferty, who's the chief executive at Merseycare, because it will be very, very difficult for a lot of people, especially with this additional set of lockdown measures, and we understand that will have a detrimental impact on people's mental health and well-being. So we're expecting a national epidemic that follows, hopefully, a post-pandemic recovery. But of course, those people will need additional resources, and that's what we're looking at: capacity issues and developing capacity to ensure that those people who will be suffering, and there are people who are suffering at the moment, we need to be working together again with the national government to say what comes next. And I think this is a big moment for everybody, and the Cinderella of the sort of NHS, which has always been mental health, really does need to have the resource provided to it so that we can respond to the demands in the next few months and beyond.
Thanks. I'll just hand back to Andy.
Well, thanks, Ross, and thanks everybody for your questions. And I'm really pleased to be able to do this jointly with Steve today, because we're not going to, as we've said, be divided, or the impression given that we're not on the same page, because we're on completely the same page, as you've heard. Just on the legal question that I raised, it wouldn't be to fight tier 3 per se. It would be to support people discriminated against as a result of that, as Steve was saying, and I think he was indicating that we would be prepared to look at acting jointly for people there, people who are self-employed, people on a 67% furlough who couldn't access universal credit. So that's not an idle threat. We will do anything to protect our residents, particularly those facing real hardship running up to Christmas. So, just want to be clear about that. But from here, we will go into discussions with the government. This thing is not resolved yet. It's up to the government what it wants to do. But if a regional approach is to work rather than the national approach put forward by the leader of the opposition, I think I would just say to the Prime Minister and Chancellor, you know, fully fund your regional approach to give it half a chance of working. Kind of going down this path without funding it, so you without giving people in mine and Steve's position the ability to sort of take the more cautious approach that the Chief Medical Officer was advocating. That will not work, and then you will be in a national circuit break. And imagine where that will leave the country if that's where it gets to. So we've hit a critical moment on this journey against the virus. You know, for anyone saying that Steve and I are playing politics, we have worked hard all year to work with the government constructively, and it remains the case. If they deal with us properly, we will deal with them and we'll come back together. But it does require them listening to what we are saying and understanding that we can't just abandon our residents to hardship, redundancy and business failure, and we will never ever do that. So as things stand, we will oppose any move to tier 3. I think you've got that message very clearly this afternoon. Thanks everybody for attending. You will have all of our slides that you're normally used to issued via the mayoral account at the end of this. Thanks to you all.